Good evening, MICA. Welcome. Welcome. My name's Tiffany Holmes. I'm the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies, and I'm here to welcome everyone to our event tonight. This event, Making Good, Big Questions in Art and Design, is inspired by MICA's Fall Constitution Day event, which brings artists, scholars, and activists together to discuss pressing questions about civil liberties. Making Good is a space for addressing questions of consequence in art and design, creating space for critical engagement across disciplines, and deepening campus discourse about ethical, aesthetic, and theoretical questions related to our work. Tonight's focus is questions about authorship and ownership in art making, and how we proceed with successful critique in this complex cultural and political moment. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to issue just a few thank yous. Thank you to the Provost's Office, the Office of Undergraduate Studies, the Division of Liberal Arts, and MICA's graduate program in curatorial practice for supporting our program tonight. And we have two guests who are going to be here with us. Coco Fusco is an interdisciplinary artist and writer and the Andrew Banks Endowed Professor of Art at the University of Florida. She is a recipient of a 2014 Census Fellowship, a 2013 Guggenheim Fellowship, a 2013 Absolute Art Writing Award, a 2013 Fulbright Fellowship, a 2012 U.S. Artist Fellowship, and many more. Fusco's performances and videos have been presented in the 56th Venice Biennale, 2 Whitney Biennials, BAM's Next Wave Festival, the Sydney Biennial, the Johannesburg Biennial, and many, many more. She is represented by the Alexander Gray Associates in New York. Fusco is also the author of several books, starting with English is Broken Here, Notes on Cultural Fusion in the Americas, The Bodies That Were Not Ours and Other Writings, and a field guide for female interrogators. She is also the editor of Corpus Delicti, Performance Art of the Americas, and Only Skin Deep, Changing Visions of the American Self. Her new book, entitled Dangerous Moves, Performance and Politics in Cuba, was recently issued by Tate Publications in London. Our second guest, Kirsten Leenaars, is a wonderful former colleague of mine. She is an interdisciplinary artist and experimental documentary maker based in Chicago. Various forms of performance, theater, and documentary strategies make up the threads that run through her work. She engages with individuals and communities to create participatory video and performance work. Her work oscillates between fiction and documentation as she examines the nature of our constructed realities, the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we identify with, and explores the way in which we relate to others. In her work, she aims to bring to light a shared humanity, often through humor and play. Recent projects include Rehousing the American Dream, which began in 2015 and is ongoing, a multi-year performative documentary project with American-born and refugee youth commissioned by the Haggerty Museum of Art in Milwaukee, and Notes on Empty Chairs, a series of 3 performances about loss, community, and empathy, produced for the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago in response to the work of Doris Salcedo. Her work has been shown nationally and internationally at venues including the District of Columbia Art Center in Washington, D.C., the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and Printed Matter in New York. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of Contemporary Practices and the Performance Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And tonight, one of my fantastic colleagues, Christine Manganero, will moderate our discussion tonight. Christine is a historian of the modern US and a historian of science. She is the Associate Dean of Liberal Arts here at MICA, where she has been on the Humanistic Studies faculty since 2012. Her work has focused on the politics of academic knowledge about race in the US empire, the social and cultural authority of expertise, public historical memory, and recently, the history of the concept of community and the kind of social projects it authorizes. Now, before I invite our first speaker out to the stage, you may be wondering why we have a phone number posted here. This is a phone number that you can text any questions or queries or concerns you have that you want to convey to our distinguished panel tonight. So our first presenter is going to be Kirsten Leenaars, and I'm going to invite her out to the stage now. Please join me in welcoming Kirsten to the stage.
Thank you, Tiffany, for that introduction. And thank you for MICA for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be here and to be part of this discussion. I will talk about my work and the questions that drive my work. My work is rooted in documentary practices, and the questions I ask myself as a maker are how do I create images? How do I construct a narrative? What stories are being told and by whom? How can we see and imagine differently? I work through these questions through working collaboratively. Rehousing the American Dream is a community-based, cumulative, performative documentary project I started in January 2016, working with a group of 24 middle school students from Milwaukee and the Haggerty Museum of Art at Marquette University. Sorry, I lost my cursor. Could I get somebody from tech up here to help me find my cursor? Oh, so I got it, I think. I found it. Sorry for that. Rehousing the American Dream provides a collective forum for refugee and American-born children to engage critically with the intersecting issues of immigration, segregation, and housing, and to reimagine and envision the American dream. The project raises questions about notions of home, belonging, and happiness that inform our collective understanding of the American dream, a concept alluring in the simplicity and ambiguity at the same time. During a 3-week video shoot in June 2016, structured as a summer camp, personal histories and experiences from the participating students served as metaphors to explore the real and imagined reality of the American dream. Incredibly aware of the political climate and the issues at stake in the then upcoming election, these students gave voice to the ideals of the society they wanted to create. They articulated sophisticated and hopeful visions for a better, more caring community and world. The students, during that time, re-envisioned the Constitution through 16 hashtags, which in turn turned into protest signs, which they paraded and planted throughout the neighborhood. We spoke about the Pledge of Allegiance and discovered that the very first version includes equality for all and doesn't mention one nation under God. Laying in the grass of an abandoned lot in Milwaukee, the kids signed the original pledge, arms reaching for the sky. The kids imagined and built their dream houses and proceeded to sell them in an improvised Telcel commercial, new and definitely improved. And here you can kind of see some of the dream houses they imagined and built from cardboard and whatever materials were around. Inspired by the model dream houses, they created large-scale houses from cardboard, taking over an entire parking lot in the neighborhood. It was a very windy day, which made for some beautiful cinematic moments. These and other performative actions became the narrative material for a 3-channel video installation and additional video works, which were exhibited at the museum. And here is an image of the 3-channel video installation at the Haggerty Museum of Art. The show was up during the fall of 2016, and after the elections, in talking with the curator and the participants, we decided to continue the project for another year, working with the exact same group of kids. The group decided that they wanted to talk about the future. In a time that felt very uncertain to them, it became an interesting challenge to imagine what the future might be like. The kids, 12 and 13 at the time, sighed at the challenge they had set for themselves: how to imagine a future. Who gets to imagine what? What are the politics of imagination? The kids astutely remarked that they didn't know if the images they had in mind of possible future were their own or something they had seen on TV, or read about, or seen in movies. The abstractness of the future became both an interesting visual and conceptual ploy for this iteration. The camp took place at the same time the nationalist protests in Charlottesville happened. We discussed the burden of history and taking down of the monuments. In response, the students designed collectively a monument of the future. As a procession through the neighborhood, the kids carried the different parts to a hilly stretch of grass where they erected their monument. And here is the monument that they had envisioned, monument of the future. We looked at reenactment as another way of renegotiating history and imagining a future. Throughout the camp, we performed Simone Forti's Huddle at different sites. The kids took turns being in the huddle and climbing over the huddle, giving support and finding balance through each other. We re-performed Ligia Pape's The Divisor and talked about what it means to be a collective body or a political body. And we talked about the movement of a group of people out of necessity. Here they are performing their own version of The Divisor in the streets of Milwaukee. The students created a sensorial cartography of the future, of the individual and the collective. These actions, interwoven with personal stories, formed the basis of a 3-channel video work and other work that was also exhibited at the Haggerty Museum in the fall of 2017. Sorry, I seem to keep losing my cursor. This work is currently part of an exhibition at MICA, part of the show Everyday, 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 Everyday Freedoms, and you can see the full version of this 3-channel video piece. A week after the summer camp ended in 2017, the curator Emilia Leyden asked if we should do another year. And the answer was yes, not just because I felt the need to continue these conversations, but because these preteens already had asked, when are we going to do next year? During that year, they decided they wanted to talk about freedom. They were inspired by the Parkland High School protest and students taking the lead on anti-gun protests. Additionally, Milwaukee has a very interesting civil rights movement history. The NAACP youth chapter that was part of the NAACP in Milwaukee had played an instrumental role in organizing civil rights protests in the 60s. For this iteration, we visited different sites in Milwaukee that had been crucial locations for the civil rights movement and where important protests and marches happened, and we commemorated these actions through creating new performances on these sites. We visited, amongst other places, the Freedom House, the former NAACP youth chapter's headquarters that had been burned down after one of the protests by a white supremacist. There's no marker of this history, nothing left that reminds you of what had happened there. The kids taped out an outline of a house and then proceeded to march along the lines that marked this place. We talked about freedom and gestures of protest. We talked about who gets to move freely in public space. And based on these conversations, we developed a choreography of protest gestures performed at Koziewski Park, where in the 60s, one of the fair housing marches came to a violent halt. Throughout the video, the teens proclaim, "We are the people," as a way of claiming the Constitution's preamble, "We the people." They build a radio station and voice their own messages of freedom to the world. This resulted in another 3-channel video piece, here shown in 2018 at the Hagerty Museum of Art. And with this last excerpt and the 3rd iteration of Rehousing the American Dream, Freedom Principles, I conclude my section.
Trump should not be a president. Don't vote for Donald Trump.
They're walking out as a national protest.
Love your neighbor as you love yourself.
It was on March.
And just to remind you, the U.S. is the only country doing it. Scared of bad
to 19-year-old gun.
And everybody already know that he lied about that he building a wall. And other countries are.
My main question is, are politicians really doing enough to keep our schools safe?
This is Radio Freedom.
So this is my message.
Radio Freedom.
I am Isa. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Is this your computer? No. No, okay, well, I'm just going to go like this. Yeah, I'm not showing pictures, so now I have to talk with a phone number next to me, which is really like, it's not my phone number. I'm not trying to get somebody to call me, or it feels a little bit bizarre. No, I thought, because I thought that, we were supposed to be talking about questions of cultural appropriation and ethics and this sort of thing, that I didn't want to focus on what I do as an artist, because I feel like these are questions that are much bigger than me as an individual, and that are ones that people all over the art world are kind of wrestling with right now, so I wanted to talk about it in a more general way. But I just want to start out by saying that I read recently about a student here, I think it's Deanne, is that how you say her name, Moses, who did a senior thesis project called Black Ives. And I really wanted to commend her for doing a project that unearths unsettling racist history associated with the school that she goes to, okay? That's a very important form of institutional critique, and it's a very brave gesture from a student. I deal with students all the time who have concerns about the histories of their institutions, and they're afraid to talk about it because they're afraid that their fellowship will be taken away, or that teachers will go after them, or that they'll even be kicked out of school. So I recognize the bravery of that gesture, and I also appreciate the receptive manner that the administration at MICA embraced the project and its implications. That I was very pleased to see that. It doesn't always happen that way in schools. So, and I also see a connection between that project and Fred Wilson's exhibition here that took place at the Maryland Historical Society in 1992, which is probably before many of you were born. But it was, he brought out artifacts that hadn't been shown, that evoked the history of slavery and segregation in Maryland, and he juxtaposed those artifacts with decorative and fine art objects that usually represent the state's past in a much more romantic way. And that exhibition, I heard about and learned about and then went to see that exhibition when I was like 32, a long time ago. But it completely opened my mind to a different way of engaging with those questions. And the exhibition radically transformed how museums all over the country and also in other countries deal with their collections and the relationship between their collections and the history of peoples of the African diaspora. So I hope that a student project like this can have a similar effect in the area of art education. So the first question that was put to me has to do with artists' use of subject matter that seems to be outside their immediate experience or supposedly doesn't belong to them. And the question is to kind of think about what's at stake in these controversies. And this is a subject that I have been called upon to talk about many, many times. And I'm actually working on an essay right now that deals with something that's sort of related, so I'll read you a couple of excerpts from that. But I first want to I think we need to think in a very analytical way about what we mean by ownership. Because the kinds of controversies that have been taking place in the art world in the last couple of years are not really about legal ownership or legal rights. They're about claims to moral authority. And that's a little different than ownership in the legal sense, okay? When there's an instance of copyright infringement, like when you own a copyright on some creative work, the matter is settled through legal means. You don't have a protest, you just go to court, okay? Or you settle out of court. But there are elements in the moral arguments that are not really logical, okay? So, I understand where people are coming from when they get upset about, this person or that person ripping off a culture, but if we're all artists or arts professionals here, we have to kind of ask about the implications of these questions. So does this mean that Renaissance painters in Italy who painted scenes from the life of a Palestinian Jew, otherwise known as Jesus Christ, a man who lived centuries before them in another part of the world, that all those paintings should be dismissed because his culture doesn't belong to them? Or what culture do I own if I migrate to one country or to more than one country? Or if I belong to more than one community? And who owns speculative fictions like sci-fi? These are constructs that don't exist and that are not rooted in a specific community or time or place or people. And what about all the young people, like many of you out here, who spend a lot of time on YouTube and Instagram and appropriate copyrighted music, impersonate celebrities, and recombine fragments of movies and cartoons and magazines, sometimes just to put them out there and have fun, but sometimes to make work? I mean, isn't that also an exercise in appropriation? So it's really important to keep in mind the distinctions here, that there's one thing is moral authority, another thing is expertise, another thing is copyright, and another thing is property ownership. And these are all claims to ownership, okay? And I can retain as an artist copyright, but I give away physical ownership of my work to an institution or an individual that buys it. So we both own it, but we own the work in different ways, okay? If I consider myself, or if someone is considered an expert on a subject or a style or a tradition or a method, that expertise isn't based on genetics or ethnicity or any kind of group affinity. It's based on professional status and learning, right? And that's not an illegitimate claim to ownership of a certain kind. There are claims to moral authority that are based on essentialist notions of identity that I would argue are flawed. Genetics doesn't transmit cultural knowledge. Genetics can transmit illness. It can transmit all sorts of problematic physical conditions, but it doesn't transmit knowledge. It doesn't give you an automatic access to knowledge. So, and community-based knowledge, which some would ascribe to ethnicity, but there are other formulations of community, is in flux because communities are in flux. Even the ways that communities are defined in the age of the internet and social media has changed completely from the way communities were defined in my childhood, which was probably for some of you a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things wasn't that long ago. Okay, we live in a world in which there are subcultures that are organized around politics, around sexuality, around fandom, around leisure activities, and around professional interests. They're all legitimate communities, okay? So, and we can participate in many of them, but they don't necessarily guarantee ownership of the customs and practices and discourses that we use, okay? We are, sometimes when we get into these tussles about ownership of artifacts or traditions, we're really resorting to understandings of identity that come from early 20th century anthropology. They're models of discrete cultures living in isolation from each other, transmitting knowledge through shared rituals and languages that are only known to those groups. I don't know very many people in the world who live that way anymore. I'm not trying to say here that subcultures or that subalterity doesn't exist anymore, because that's not true, but the boundaries that define communities or that are not so rigid, and affinity is not singular or monological. So I think we have to kind of understand where we are and what's going on, and then adapt our understanding and our kind of claims to community based on the world that we actually live in and not a model from over 100 years ago, okay? And I think that that's particularly important because if we don't, what we end up with is kind of the character of some protests these days in which we just are engaged in character assassination of individual artists or grandstanding on the basis of moral authority that is not always that easily defensible. I do think that we can respect the authenticity of personal experience and also recognize the value of the capacity for imaginative projection that is art's special gift to the world. So that means I don't want to throw out those Renaissance artists who painted scenes from the Bible, and I also don't want to throw out the work of white artists who were involved in anti-lynching campaigns in the 1930s, or artists from any background who choose to work on material from another background or culture, or I want to look at the work and understand whether or not I think it's effective, whether I think it's compelling, whether I think it offers a vision of things that I haven't seen before, and then pass judgment on that basis. Okay, so I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs from an essay that I'm working on in which I try to wrestle with some of these issues. Okay, so I'll start with one of them. It is impossible to ignore that a great deal of contemporary art casts a critical look at our past and present conduct. But the venture of art making is not bound by the rules or expectations that constrain fact-based modes of representation, such as journalism or legal testimony. Art isn't reportage. You don't need to be there to imagine a realistic story. Art draws us into experience that we may not have lived, but seek nonetheless to know. While artists in authoritarian societies that censor public access to information often channel through their art exactly what their states suppress, it is precisely because creativity involves imaginative extrapolation from fact that art can take us into the recesses of our collective psyche and reveal ambiguities of selfhood that conventional truth-telling misses. To describe lynched bodies as strange fruit swinging from poplar trees, or to smile and say, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," before bombing a Vietnamese village, conveys dimensions of human depravity that are derived from historical events, but they are neither testimonies of actual experience nor depictions of fact. And I want to remind you that Strange Fruit, the song, is associated with Billie Holiday because she sang it, but was written by a New York Jewish intellectual activist named Abel Meeropol, who never saw a lynching. He only saw a photograph of one. And it's probably one of the most famous artistic evocations of lynching that we have. And that Apocalypse Now, which is where that line about loving the smell of napalm comes from, was based on a novel that wasn't set in Vietnam by a Polish writer named Joseph Conrad. And it ended up becoming one of the most important and representations of the impact of the Vietnam War that we have. So, it's not that I'm trying to dismiss authenticity and personal experience and testimony, but I don't think we need to be limiting ourselves to that. Another quote from this essay: "Art achieves its effect by deviating from fact and complicating power dynamics in its representation of ethically questionable phenomena. While art may converge with activist efforts, it also operates at registers that are not as literal as the pragmatic and functionalist spheres of protest or legal testimony. Art may cajole you, it may surprise you, or shock you, but its effects are rarely immediate, and its truths are not bound by experience. Attempts to regulate symbolic representation in the service of political goals, however progressive those goals may seem, have often had perilous consequences. Most of us in the cultural sphere are well aware that the social values of political conservatives lead to their demands for restrictions on artistic expression. We do well to remember that sectors of the left have also experimented with enforcing codes of conduct and banishing aesthetic ambiguity from their revolutions. It's worth taking note of this because the art world is currently immersed in a political struggle over the parameters of artistic license and the ethical responsibilities of art institutions. In that battle, calls for institutional change are often combined with demands that the expressive speech of artists be judged on the basis of its purported adherence to a truth guaranteed by identity. Cultural activists and critics pit the economic power of museums and the market against morally derived assertions of rights based on public interest, cultural property, or personal experience. These skirmishes are not surprising, given that the extreme polarization of wealth and power in the art world mirrors that of the rest of society, despite the liberal veneer that cultural institutions maintain. In other words, we are showered with rhetoric about freedom we all enjoy, while at the same time we are surrounded by evidence of failed democratic promise. But subjecting artistic gestures to ethical imperatives or conflating an individual artist's capacity for imaginative projection with the economic opportunism of an industry quickly becomes a violent exercise in itself, especially when the channels of communication is a social media sphere prone to hyperbole. And I just want to emphasize there that sometimes, in the moment of tension, that we tend to start sort of yelling at individuals as if they had the power of Hollywood or a broadcasting system. And when we begin to evaluate what it means to use elements of a culture that we may not identify as our own, I think we need to look at the balance of power involved in that equation. And that it's very different to talk about the exclusionary practices of American museums as a system, and then to talk about a particular decision that an individual makes to put something or not put something in an artwork, or to talk about something or not talk about something. We are affected as a society by the refusal, for example, to address certain aspects of our history. We're not traumatized in the same way or affected by an individual's utterance. And if we can't distinguish between those two, then we really can't talk about power dynamics in an intelligent way. Another question that was put to me has to do with, is there an ethics to art making that addresses history, injustice, racism, etc.? There isn't an ethics to art. There's no one ethic regarding representation of anything. We have legal regulations. We have had a history of defining certain art forms as obscene, for example. There are countries that ban the use of certain symbols, like you can't use a swastika in an artwork in Germany for obvious reasons. But there is no, ethics is a branch of philosophy that has to do with your behavior in the world and whether it's good or bad. And I don't think that, that we can apply those systems of judgment to art, but there is no absolute rule that says that there's an ethical system out there that art has to be good for you or say good things about you. There's a lot of debate, and there's a lot of history of debate about how best to engage with certain social issues, but there isn't a single answer, and there isn't a single recipe for making the work effective. So on that subject, I'm going to quote you one more thing from this piece of writing that I've been working on the last few weeks. Art about our capacity to commit acts of violence presents a special set of challenges for those who create, as well as for those who view and interpret it. The distinction between ethics and aesthetics, which many believe should be clearly defined, becomes more difficult to delineate. To be uninterested in a style of painting, for example, may bespeak a cultural bias, but it might also be an educated assessment of craft. On the other hand, to be indifferent to artistic depictions of horrific acts or evidence of grave injustice invites consternation and gives pause as to the purpose of art and the criteria by which we decide its worth. Logically speaking, we should recognize the difference between the fact that a terrible thing happened and its rendering, but in moments of political urgency, that distinction often collapses, and I think that that's what has been happening in the last year or two. The times when Kantian arguments about art appreciation being a matter of taste and recognition of universal notions of beauty reigns supreme are behind us. Postmodern interrogation of universality and taste have transformed that view into a suspect expression of elitism and ethnocentrism. So, does that mean that every negative appraisal of a depiction of human tragedy might be politically motivated? Could we or can we proffer critical judgment of a rendering that may be faithful to someone's experience? Should a work of art be considered good because of its engagement with social ills, implying thus that beauty as a concept extends beyond questions of form to embrace a moral vision? There are those who take this reasoning a step further to suggest that legacies of disenfranchisement can be rectified by treating lived experience of oppression as a license to regulate how it is spoken about. But if we venture down that path, then how do we appreciate the capacity for imaginative projection that is art's power to communicate across time, space, and the limits of our being? Can we still accept the argument that Susan Sontag made in Fascinating Fascism, which was published in 1975, regarding the attraction that symbols extricated from traumatic histories may have for those who play with them in another time and place? And when does an aggregate of works about traumatic events become the sign of a trend? When does the public revelation of a personal pain become a stepping stone to celebrity? And the last question that was put to me has to do with my thinking about participating in critique and discourse about socially engaged art in more generative or brave ways. I'm not so sure that I want to be brave when it comes to critique, because that makes me think that I'm in some sort of battle and that I need to defend myself. And I wouldn't want critique to be framed as a battle, because I think that critique is an exercise in thoughtfulness, and that what I would be asking for in these skirmishes over claims to ownership is thoughtfulness. What do we mean? And what do we want and what do we mean by this? And what is there a problem, or is there just a desire to have one's kind of place at the table? And are we gaining something with these arguments? In other words, if we want to jettison work on the basis of feeling upset about it, how do we know that that's not going to turn around and kick us in the face? And I really, I think that in the controversies that have emerged in the last couple of years around works in the Whitney Biennial, or at Jimmy Durham's show in Minneapolis and Los Angeles, or the Sam Durant scaffold piece in Minnesota, that there really has the calls for removal and destruction of work, I find really quite frightening and unthoughtful, because I don't think that those making those claims understand that it doesn't stop with one work. You start demanding that things be destroyed and taken down, and you turn around and then it's your work that's coming down. So I think I would say that, with regard to that last question, that I would say that this is not about antagonism, and it's not about a battle. It's about injecting thoughtfulness into this. And sometimes that means stepping back from one's own experience and not relying exclusively on one's own experience to exercise judgment. Okay, so I will stop there.
Hello? Okay. Hi. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can text them to this number. Thank you both for that. So in light of all the things that you just said, I'm curious for you to maybe think or extrapolate a little bit on this question about ownership and about expertise and identity and those sorts of questions. And I'm wondering about how we honor lived experience, but also work with the fact that it's essentializing, like you pointed out, Coco, to assume that someone knows or doesn't know something simply because of how they look or their race or their gender. And I'm wondering how you think about how to move forward with this kind of difficulty in a time of a kind of call-out culture, in a fraught moment on campuses. I guess this might be a question about how we are better colleagues to one another when it comes to this stuff. But I'm curious to hear maybe more comment about that.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So I've been teaching for 10 years, about 10 years now. And I think it's quite incredible how the dialogue has shifted, the discourse has shifted from 10 years ago to now, and I'm really aware of that difference. And I really embrace it, even if it's now at a really complicated moment, or we're not quite sure how to work through it always, or don't always have the best responses. I think it's so important that we have arrived here with all its complexities, but that we are actually talking about it. And I think it has made for much deeper conversations in a classroom. I'm also really, I teach a lot of freshmen, and I'm, especially since the last 3-4 years, I've been impressed with what they already bring in that first year to the table, or what they're willing to kind of talk about or expect us to. But I think that's also, there is an expectation of what they want the faculty to talk about. And sometimes, yes, it's call-out culture. Sometimes that makes things complicated. But at any of those moments, I think it's good it's on the table. It's good that we are talking about these things that I felt we were not talking about 10 years ago. And also coming from Europe with a whole different kind of history and ways of talking about art, I've learned so much being here, and compared to the Netherlands, where I had my education, I think the discussions that we're having here and now are so far ahead of some of the conversations we're having in the Netherlands. So I think as much as I feel that, yes, sometimes it's contentious and sometimes maybe we don't have the right answers, or I don't know if there is such a thing as the right answer or the right way to do it. I think it's also every time so dependent on the group of people that you're with and how that group is made up. And I think thoughtfulness is the key and being willing to listen or to take a step back. So yeah, I don't know really if that answers your question, but I think it's really important that there is that we are having a panel about this, and that things are finally kind of, that students are also expecting us to talk about this and not shy away from that. I think that's a good thing.
So, well, this is like the 5th time that this debate has emerged in my professional life. Like I remember a version of it in the 80s, and in the 80s we were talking about it in contradistinction to what had been talked about in the 70s because basically these kind of questions of, deconstructing the power dynamics in the production of knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge are largely due to the introduction of cultural studies, theories from cultural studies, but also to the introduction of ethnic studies and gender studies into the American Academy in the 70s that is an offshoot of the civil rights movement. And so a lot of the language that I learned about in the 80s came from, what did the Panthers say about domestic imperialism and how that was reproduced within an academic context, right? And, feminists were also doing protests in the 70s at the University of Chicago against the lack of attention to the history of women, in their schooling as women. So, this kind of inquiry is not new, it's not recent. I think what I do observe, though, is that art schools were more resistant to changing curriculum to reflect those debates than other areas of the humanities and the social sciences. Hard science is also very uninterested, right? And so that the era of kind of students occupying buildings and demanding certain courses of studies that happened in the humanities in the 70s, and then again in the 90s, and then again in the aughts, that it's just now beginning to hit art school. And why is it beginning to hit art school? I think there's 2 reasons why it's beginning to hit art school. One is that basically art schools are mostly tuition driven, and they've had to globalize their student populations, and so that there's a more diverse student population, but no transformation of curriculum, right? So you have more and more students coming in asking questions about a Eurocentric curriculum being fed to an increasingly non-European student body. Okay, so that's, I think, why this tension, and that's one reason. I think the other reason is that I think a lot of young people have been very inspired by Black Lives Matter. And that this is the civil rights movement of the generation of students that I'm teaching now. And it's by Black Lives Matter, by Standing Rock, by Me Too. These are the iterations of calls for social justice of a younger generation of people, and that art students are wrestling with what that means when you take these concerns that have to do with violence and oppression in real life, and how do you translate them into the needs that students have when they are producing symbols, right? Because art is really about symbolic communication. And it's not the same, but I can understand the desire to have some sort of reverberation of that enter into education. I think that, institutions are responding not perfectly, but with a modicum more sensitivity than they once did. I mean, when I was complaining as an undergraduate about Baudelaire's representation of a Black woman in his poetry, my French professor basically told me to leave, When I had my dissertation defense, and it was about post-colonial art, I had a reader, who was on my committee who was saying, does this even exist as a field? So, that you don't hear, people are you get in trouble for having that kind of indifference, because as instructors handling these clients who pay so much money, we're supposed to be more sensitive to their needs, right? So we see some change in that. I do think that a lot needs to be done in unthinking the Eurocentric dimensions of art education, and that what the inclination of professors is just to try to be nice and kind of touchy-feely with students who are complaining, but that's not the way to remedy the problem. It's not just by listening to students complain. It's about transforming the way they learn, and that takes a lot more work than just being sensitive to your pain. That's why I get tired of the just be sensitive to your pain model.
So you'd say that having just an emotional response to this is actually a kind of inequity, an inequitable response.
It doesn't change anything. The thing is, education is not therapy. I am not a teacher to help you with your pain. I'm a teacher to help you become an artist and to learn about art. And I obviously can't be insensitive if you're suffering as a student, but being sensitive to your suffering is not teaching you, right? That's not education. And I think that, a lot of art schools' response to multiculturalism up to this point has been the therapeutic response and not the pedagogical or curricular response, which is really where I think it has to go.
So I'm thinking about the converging places where conversations like this are happening. There's the space and the language of critique. There's art criticism as a really broad field. And I'm curious for you to reflect a little bit on the ways in which the platform of social media has affected the way that art criticism operates. Maybe it's been democratizing, but I'm wondering what it means in practice, that is a space now where the speed and kind of virality of people's responses is available. And I'm wondering, too, how social media is affecting the way that we talk to each other about work, because I suspect that that's in there somewhere, but you would maybe know better than I would.
I would have to think about it, because I'm thinking about, how has it affected me? I can't really speak for how my students, how I feel it has maybe influenced the way they experience work or look at work, sorry. I think it's also, this is such a big question for me, because then I also think, well, how, obviously I read art criticism, but I also take that with a salt of grain. So I don't know really, I find it hard to say if social media, what that relationship exactly is. I honestly haven't really thought about that, and I find a hard time to think if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I guess I think for people
it's so immediate is my first thought, right? Yeah.
But are you trying to, I guess I'm not quite sure what you're trying to, do you think that's a negative thing, or do you think that's a democratizing thing?
I think that there are negative things, and that there are other things that are not so negative. I've been involved in talking about culture and cultural politics on the internet since it went public. I was, part of listservs before there was social media, right? And it was kind of exciting to be in a space of conversation with so many people in so many parts of the world, and we could kind of share information, but also you learn about how people think about things in Slovenia or in Singapore or wherever, right? And it's coming at you every morning. But I did notice that there was a tendency to respond very quickly and to sometimes be flip, right? And that there's something about the relative anonymity of internet communication where you can step away, you can actually pretend not to be you, or you can step away, or you can, you know, you're answering like while you're, you know, whatever, changing your kid's diaper, or, you know, supposedly in class, but you're actually on Facebook or whatever. And so there's a way in which you're not really fully paying attention. There's a way in which this stuff is very intrusive into your space of privacy and your leisure time. And so I had to learn how to moderate my own and modulate my own, the tone of voice in internet communication. And it took a while. There was a term that came up in the night, flame wars, you know, and flaming. We called it flaming when you got too nasty or excited and did everything in caps and started yelling at people, right? But I mean, I learned if you get engaged in this stuff before you have coffee in the morning, it's not a good idea, right? But I think what's happened, you know, a lot has happened in the last, what is it now? More than 25 years or something. And that, I mean, one thing that's happened is that people don't look at art, they look at pictures on the internet, right? And curators don't go to studios, they look at websites. And so we tend to substitute you know, a visual representation and a digital representation of art for a physical experience of art and our interaction. I mean, people come up to me all the time and say, you know, I'm your friend on Facebook. And I'm like, there are 5,000 of them and I don't know like 90% of those people. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, you know, and talk like as if they know me like in real life. And that's very odd, right? But I think that that's what social media does, is that it breeds a sort of strange sense of familiarity, but it also leads to very flip and very unexamined, you know, throwing out of statements and ideas, and that can be somewhat dangerous at times. And, you know, blogs are not fact-checked, and, you know, a lot of young people read them indiscriminately. I have to tell students all the time that they should not be using blogs as evidence for papers, because nobody fact-checks any blog. And that, you know, you just have to be careful with the information, and I don't think that we are as careful with the information that's on social media and the internet as we could be, nor are we careful about the logic that we use when we argue. We tend to kind of come from the gut. And that leads sometimes to really unfortunate statements and also to shaming of people and false accusations and character assassination and of kind of forgetting of something fundamental in the ethical basis of our society, which is that we have a rule of law here, and that we are not guilty until proven so, no matter how many people on Facebook say otherwise. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because there is a tendency to personalize in these exchanges, and it is very harmful to people's lives.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, though, as you're saying this, is I'm thinking about all the things that can't be decided, there can't be perfect evidence. And I'm thinking specifically to the case that you've written about with Dana Schutz's work at the Whitney Biennial in 2017. And I remember tracking all the different things that people said that work was about. And this is the painting of Emmett Till that Dana Schutz did that was part of her work shown in that biennial. And so, you know, the question then becomes like, who gets to decide what that work is about, or is that even the right question? I guess I'm not sure.
If interesting works of art were only about one thing, we would have nothing to learn. I mean, you know, this is kind of one of the points that I was trying to make in what I was reading, is that art isn't good because it tells you about a fact. That's what journalism is for, okay? That's not what art is for. Even when art purports to represent an historical event, it's the purpose of it is not to transmit a fact about it. I mean, art tells you a million things other than those facts, and that's why we still talk about works 1,000 years later, or 5,000 years later, or 5 years later. So, you know, this kind of reductive logic that it's only about one thing, that it only means one thing, that it can only be one way, that you can't do it this way, that you know, no self-respecting artist would want to be constrained that way to make work about anything.
Okay, yeah. Man, I don't know. I'm going to actually go to a question from our from the audience, and let's see. So one of the questions, this is perfect actually given the audience here tonight. So Coco, you mentioned that the response doesn't need to be therapeutic, it needs to be pedagogical. So what are some of the key elements that you see as critical for contemporary arts pedagogy?
Well, it depends on, like, teaching what? Teaching a particular skill, or, you know, the language. Okay, I think, you know, obviously, students, it would be nice if students had a more exposure to art history, to contemporary art history, to a broader field of reference, but that's only the beginning. You know, I actually have learned a lot from talking to students, because I studied a little bit of film and photography, but I was a humanities undergraduate major in a university, not in an art school, so I didn't have the art school experience. But over the years, I've been teaching now for 25 years, students have mentioned things, and one time one young woman said something to me that I will never forget, and she said, you know, she was a painting major, and she said, you know, we learned how to mix colors and pigments to make flesh tones for Caucasians only. We never learned how to mix pigments to make any other flesh tone. So it's not that I don't want to make pictures of black people, it's that I don't know how to get the color right, okay? And, you know, I had filmmaker friends who had, you know, brought up from the beginning of when I was studying that film stock, analog film stock, is calibrated for white skin, and that they had to kind of rethink lighting to adjust, I guess, everything, exposures, so that because, you know, you can tell in a lot of color pictures of black people that the skin looks terrible, right? It's just like you can't see, the detail in a person's face doesn't show, right? So, you know, they have to kind of rethink these Eurocentric tools to use in a different context. But I thought, oh, so how do you begin then to think about how to teach painting in a different way? You know, there have been some movements in African American painting that thought about palette differently, like not thinking about everything against white, but against black. You know, thinking about different color schemes that are drawn from African textile design. You know, there are different people. Even the Spiral Group just thought, well, during the Civil Rights Movement, maybe I should just eliminate color altogether and have everything be black and white, because we're in a moment of racial polarization and so you have all these incredible Norman Lewis paintings, right, from that time period, and others that are all in black and white. So there are, you know, a lot of different ways of thinking about this, right? But the point is to do so and then to teach things differently, right? So that one can be aware of and sensitive to and cognizant of and prepared for these different modes of representation and the different figures that one might want to represent.
Do you have anything to add to that? No, I think the historical context is really important to know that, and that's one. But yeah, and one thing that I think is also important is to, especially with freshmen, but really for any student, is to also think about how do they see their own relationship to the world, the outside world. I mean, and not everybody has to make social commentary in their work, but there is always a relationship to the world outside, even if it's an abstract painting that wants to talk about color or texture. And I think that's important relationship to start talking about, and how you formulate that, or what are the questions you ask yourself as an artist making your work, and to uncover that.
So thinking about historical content and and symbols as the content of art. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about appropriation, which you mentioned, as part of the same spectrum. So it's a same spectrum of practice, but maybe with different social and aesthetic consequences. So I'm thinking as I ask this about the fact that we maybe define a line between influence, which I would say none of us can escape. Some of us may not want to escape it. And also a kind of inappropriate appropriation. And I think maybe a sub-comment here is that that's cultural appropriation is not an observing comment anymore, it's a accusatory comment. And so how do we think about where there's some kind of, is there a line that we want to try to define between this is sort of the language of art and this is insensitive and inappropriate?
There's a lot of art that's insensitive and inappropriate. There's a lot of pornography that's actually really interesting, but is deemed obscene.
Yeah.
There's a lot of erotica that is, there's erotica from the late 19th century that shows like white abolitionist women wanting to have sex with black guys they're liberating. I mean, people will make pictures of anything they can imagine and more than you can imagine, okay? And, the question is, like, do you want to throw it all out because you don't like it? I mean, that's like my mother's attitude about performance art, I don't want to live in a world where you get to throw it out because you don't like it.
Right. So my next question is, though, if we don't want to throw it out because we don't like it, what is the response? Like, I mean, I guess I'm curious.
You don't have to be there. I'm sorry, but if you don't like it, don't go to the show. Mm-hmm. Don't go to the show. That's it.
Okay. Okay.
If I were like a commercial designer and I had a client that I had to satisfy, then I would worry about whether the client liked it. Mm-hmm. I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm an artist, and I didn't like become an artist to make you like me.
Okay.
I don't think most artists, I don't think that's what's foremost in their mind when they're making their work. They're not doing it to be liked. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you do things because you want to make people angry for a good reason. Mm-hmm. And there's also works that are sort of not very interesting or dumb or poorly executed that don't really open your mind to anything in an interesting way. But I'm not going to kind of, there is one law on the books in this country that has to do with legislating who can be considered a legitimate author of an artwork, and it has to do with Native American work. Mm-hmm. And it was a law that was developed in the 1930s, and it's basically about kind of imposing an understanding of aesthetic tradition on certain indigenous ethnic groups. Mm-hmm. And it has been used in more recent times to kind of harness economic, like only a certain group of people can garner wealth from the product. But it's also been used punitively to remove artists who I like from the definition of Native American, like Jimmy Durham, right? Mm-hmm. So I see both sides of that, right? But other than that law, I don't know of another one, other than obscenity restrictions on, what artists can do. Mm-hmm.
So one of the members of the audience is asking about this opinion of like not going to the show, right? Like you don't have to go if you don't want to. And the question is, does that make a kind of segregation more profound, or is that a kind of passive attitude to the problem?
Look, most Americans don't go to any art museum. And even fewer of them look at contemporary art. We're talking about a tiny little realm of, in a big sea, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a tremendous political concern about the nature of representations, symbolic representations, and their impact on society, looking at visual art is kind of the wrong place to start. Because the impact is created by the film industry, by the game industry, by television, and by a very debased kind of culture that circulates in spaces like YouTube. That's where prejudice and taste are most, can operate like a hammer, right? And can really have a very negative effect. And that's why in the early part of the 20th century, the NAACP focused on popular cultural representations because it was easy to prove scientifically the impact of an image culture that was so totalizing, okay? We're not talking about that. We're talking about a little universe of individual production that, whether we like it or not, I mean, it really hurts to say it, but it is a reality that I have to live with as a professional artist. Art is different from like cinema and television and even mass market fiction in that for those forms of culture to be successful, they have to be popularly accepted. Artwork just has to be bought by one person. And if the rest of us don't like it, it's not going to trump the power of the institution or the individual that purchased it, right? So we have a different economy, a different power structure, and also we're talking about, the relative influence of an individual versus that of an industry. And I just can't, I don't think it logically or politically it makes sense to look at those things in the same way. And, it is a choice to engage with art as a cultural form. It is not an obligation. And so, yes, my son had to look at Starry Night when he was in second grade, but it's not like the impact of years and years of, what do you get to read in literature, and do you ever read an African-American author or a Latino author or a Native American author in the course of your education, okay? So, I mean, no, it's not segregation, excuse me, but segregation, by definition, is, imposed by a government on a population. It's law. It's not choice. So it's just a misnomer. It's not the appropriate term to talk about choosing whether or not to look at an artwork.
A couple of questions that folks are asking, and this is one I was curious about too, is thinking about not wanting to throw away artwork or kind of rejecting the idea that artwork should be destroyed. And the question is about how we deal with debates about removing things like Confederate monuments and other, symbolic, but powerful pieces that are, that subscribe to a perspective that maybe we don't want in public space anymore. And that in some cases kind of whitewash U.S. history. Is that a different thing altogether, monuments versus, fine art?
I would think so, because I do think monuments have a much more public presence and often function in a very different, in a more public way, in a significant markers for some kind of a perceived accomplishment. Or so I do think that's different than an artwork, or it becomes symbolic for a certain city or place. And so I think it's a different thing. And I think when the decision has been made to remove certain monuments, I do think there is something to say for not just destroying them, but contextualizing them in a different way, so that it's not like we're just not gonna talk about that history that was the things that really happened and were at stake, but that they get they are reframed in a new story, and maybe there's a new monument or statue or sculpture that is being made, or maybe it's a video projection, I don't know. But so I think the removal of monuments, I think there's a place for that, but I don't think destruction is necessarily the answer. But I think it's like, well, what is the right place, and how can we address the whole conversation around that?
I agree. I think the thing is, what's different for me about a monument is that it is, or a memorial, is that these are official, usually state subsidized representations of the history of a place, right? And so it's not an individual opinion, it's the official opinion about what is important in history. And that carries a lot more political significance as far as I'm concerned. I agree that that I wouldn't destroy them, that I would relocate the monuments to, because they will serve an educational purpose, even if they no longer represent the official history of the nation or the state or the city that they were a part of. And, you know, I mean, I have to constantly be looking for archival sources to show students in class about, like, the history of racist caricature, because you're not supposed to do it anymore. But I'm like, well, but if you don't know what was done, then you won't know why it was banned, right? So we got, you know, I have to look for it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting being in Baltimore because there's at least one Confederate monument that was removed at the behest of the mayor, 2 years ago? It wasn't actually a state funded monument. It was a wealthy patron that had it commissioned and then got someone in the city to agree to plop it down. It was quite literally someone buying their own art, buying a piece of art that they really liked, and then it took on this. It took on the function of telling official history, but it was really one person's taste. So I just think that's an interesting juxtaposition with that state history comment. I'm going to ask another question from our audience here. So here's a question that's probably sort of hot. What are your thoughts about cultural appropriation paintings, which we could question that category?
That is not a definition of a painting.
Well, hold on. So, yeah, but I think this is a well-intended question we should grapple with. And the question is, what do you do if you have a white male painter with a certain amount of privilege painting about something like the Baltimore uprising, the post-Freddie Gray uprising in Baltimore? If the purpose is good intention, the question is, does it give them a right to speak for other people? I think there's a lot to unpack in that question, but I will let you do that. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's hard to talk about a painting if I don't know what the painting looks like.
Right. I think this is also a question about the artist. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I can imagine a white male privileged artist making a painting that is not necessarily speaking for, but maybe just addressing that moment in time. Or so I think that's a important distinction to make, an important one to make.
I mean, I guess the premise of the question of making a painting speaking for other people, I think, is really interesting.
Artists have always done it, and I also know a lot of privileged black artists who would come and do the same. You know, I think we have to really kind of think very carefully about what is it that we're talking about here. You know, there are artists who, and there are photojournalists who go into war zones and make astonishing photographs of all sorts of, you know, the horrors of war that have, you know, won mega awards, but have also, like, affected public policy for the better. Right? And then there's Ernest Withers, whose work I love, you know, an African-American photographer who has these amazing pictures from the era of segregation, and he was an FBI informant who was ratting on black activists. You know, like, we don't know what, we can't presume to know so much about who's more privileged than whom or who is more entitled than whom to make the representation. Let's look at the work. Is the work interesting? Is it compelling? Does it show us something that we didn't already know? Is it opening us up to a different way of thinking about a problem or about painting as a medium? I mean, these are all questions that we need to ask. If the treatment of a social issue is flip or banal, then I would say that no artist should do it no matter what, even if they lived in Baltimore and were part of the protest. you know? It doesn't make it better just because you lived there if you can't make the work speak to people in an interesting way, right? Sometimes insider knowledge helps because it gives you access or it gives you a certain perception and understanding, but it's not a guarantee. And you know, I also say this not only as somebody who has to evaluate this stuff, but you know, I've been working for the last 3 years on just as an example, I have many, on a performance about the Namibian genocide in 1904. I had I don't know how many of you know, it's not really, but Germany had colonies for a little while. They were all taken away after World War I when they lost, but one of them was this part of Africa, right above South Africa, that's now Namibia. That was one of the last countries to achieve independence, not until 1990. And there were several battles in the late 19th and early 20th century between different ethnic groups in Namibia and the Germans who were settling there. And at one point, there was an uprising of two ethnic groups, the Herero and the Nama. And because their lands were being encroached upon, because they were being very mistreated by the German settlers, and they killed less than 50 people, and the German government sent, well, the German king sent, I don't know, something like 20,000 German soldiers, and they completely decimated the population. And I wanted to find a way to tell this story in Germany. Not here, in Germany, right? And it took me years to get the opportunity to do so. So it's not my culture, it's not my story, it's not my history. It really interested me, and I also felt like it was an important thing to do in Germany, right? To get a certain kind of conversation going. So what did I do? I talked to Afro-German activists. I found descendants of the Herero in Germany and talked to them. I was put in touch with a scholar from Namibia who has worked on the efforts to repatriate remains of the Herero that are still in Germany. You know, you talk to people, you converse, you learn, you get a sense of what they think is this, I even said to Memory Biwa, who's the scholar, I said, so, do you think it's a good idea to do this? And she says, yeah, you really, go, do it, right? So, I'm not of it, right? But the exercise in doing it, but I got Germans to act with me and to read the testimony of the survivors of that war in Germany. And it was an incredible kind of showdown. And I'm glad I did it. And a few months later, I got invited by other Germans to go and do it again. And now I'm invited to Denmark to go and do it there. They have a big refugee problem and a kind of colonial, post-colonial nightmare going on. And I'm glad to be able to do this with people. And, I have yet to anybody to say to me, you shouldn't be doing this, right? So I do think that there's, it's a matter of how do you go about, what kind of conversation do you have, and how do you go about this?
Okay. Let's see. There's a lot of questions about copyright. I don't, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that means. While I search for this question, I guess I was trying to formulate one myself kind of in response to what you were just saying, but this question about making cultural appropriation paintings, or who gets to respond, right, to these kinds of things. And I'm curious because I think we're all in this moment together and trying to figure out how to be responsible and make good work. What do you think this is about? Why are we in this moment where it's the tension over who's responding to something feels so great?
Moral indignation is a substitute for a rational conversation. It's an emotional response It is not a rational response. And it is a symptom, and I've written about this, of the failure of art education to give young artists the appropriate tools to interpret the culture around them and the relationship that artists have to the world. And that the answer is not to bash people on the basis of moral indignation, but to learn how to analyze how artists go about addressing issues in their work and how to evaluate those efforts in an intelligent and sensitive way that is not only about, you are not allowed to do it. Who said? Who says you're not allowed to do it? You know, I mean, I was like the rebellious firstborn who had to fight with my parents through my entire education to be able to do what I want, you know, to not have to straighten my hair, to be able to go out with boys and screw around if I felt like it, right? To say what I wanted to say at the dinner table, to be a woman and not have to get married, you know, to be able to challenge authority. And I am, you know, I am not just a woman of color, not just a woman, not just a Cuban American, not just all those things. I'm also an artist, and I'm a member of the art tribe, and I defend my tribe's right to roam in their imagination where they want to go. Because if we don't have that as artists, we can't make art well. And we may fail. We may fail, but it's a good step. Failure is still a good step. It's better than not trying.
And I think, not to make this about myself, but I sometimes get this question of like why I my work responding to certain political situations in the United States, and but my question is always, or my kind of rebuke to that is, but why not? I live in this country. I am part of this social fabric, and I feel, and that's because it's part of why I make art, is like I don't want to be just kind of a passive consumer of what is happening. I want to create some kind of response. I want a dialogue, because I think there's also a danger in saying, well, you don't get to make work about that, then it's like, then what? You're shifting a certain kind of responsibility for a certain kind of work, a certain kind of commentary to only designated groups of people, and I think that's not a good situation either. I think
you could argue that's a huge burden, actually.
Yeah, and I think it is, lost my train of thought, but no, it's fine. I think it is in the end, but how does every individual artist go about addressing a certain subject matter, and what is the dialogue that they want to create and they want to have? What are the questions that the work asks from you, both as a maker and as a viewer, and yeah.
There's a question related to this, that there's a movement towards making work, or work that can be described as being made collectively, and the question is, how do we teach an ethical or even just respectful practice for collectively created works?
You know, it's hard. Working collectively or in collaboration is very difficult. And I think some people romanticize it, okay, but it's actually really hard to share a vision, right? I don't think that it's necessary for everybody in a collective to do everything. I mean, when I've worked with others, you know, we've done different things. We've brought different skills to the table. We've brought different ideas to the table. We've been responsible for different aspects of a work. And you can still decide to call it a collective endeavor. I also, you know, now when I author a lot of things that I make, I still depend on others to work with me. It's not the same as agreeing that you're going to subsume your name to a collective name, right? But I try to be respectful of what each person puts in, and acknowledge that in the right way. But I don't think that there's a way, you know, there's so much, I worry about a generation of students who are more worried about trauma, pain, triggering, respect, than about ideas. I walked in the first week of my performance class this semester, and I showed Carolee Schneemann, may she rest in power, Meet Joy, and the first thing, they started yelling for an hour about how it was not consensual. And I'm like, this is not a Me Too conversation, you guys. This woman made this performance in 1964. She flew a whole bunch of artists to Paris to do a work, and you're telling me that they didn't agree to be there? Well, but some woman artist's leg is being dragged across. I was like, it's part of the piece. There's so much worry about that your rights may be infringed upon. Yeah, okay, but I don't think that's where to start a conversation in an art class, frankly, or in creation. It's like, what do you want to do artistically? What do you want to make? What do you want to see? What do you want to imagine? How are you going to get there? How are we going to do it? Let's talk about that and stop worrying so much about consent and rights and this. No, there are no rights. Okay? And when it comes to making art, anything goes. And, you get empowered by having others support you, and that's about it. And, you can decide on the basis of your own sense of ethics what you think is right to do, but I'm not going to play censor or preacher with other artists because they won't talk to me for very long, including students. Right? If I start dumping on them about what they should and shouldn't be doing. I had a student many years ago who said, he told me that he was in a performance class of mine, and he told me that for his MFA project that he wanted to piss into a bucket and use it to wash the van of another professor. Okay, let's talk about ethics. So I was like, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. I'm just going to tell you, I said, I refuse to censor another artist. I am not going to tell you that you can't. I'm not the one. If you want a teacher to tell you what you can and can't do, don't come to me, okay? But I'm going to let you know what the potential consequences of the act are, okay? So you will be interpreted as a male aggressor because you're a guy, and she's a woman, the professor whose car you want to cover with your piss. That this is going to be interpreted as an aggressive, sexually violent gesture to this person who is your teacher, and that you may be punished for the gesture. I won't be the one to do it. He did it, and he didn't get in trouble. So, that was I felt like my function as a professor was to evaluate the work and to advise him of the consequences, not to censor him. I had another student.
Wait, hold it. How did you evaluate the work? No, that's a real question because
we had to talk about, the use of body fluids in performance and, the meaning of certain gestures and the social significance of these gestures outside the sphere of art and, like that, how, when is it violent to use body fluids and when is it not violent to use body fluids and how is that going to be read? And, that's kind of what we talked about. But I had another student who decided, another master student at another school, who was, that for his MFA project, he was going to invite nudists to convene at school without telling any of us. So, he's like, I'm so excited about my project. I'm so excited about my project. And then, we, come into school one morning to do crits. And, there's a nudist masturbating in one corner, and then there's another nudist, I don't know what they were doing, in another room, and then in, the main room where we were supposed to be having, our receptions and stuff for students, there were, 10 of them naked, right? So, all the other professors were just, ready to kill this poor student, So it fell to me, the performance artist, to say to, congratulate him on his ability as a producer to marshal people from another state, and to find them, that he had worked consensually with other people and allowed them to express themselves, and that there was a certain value to that, respect for the values of that nudist community, and that I understood the aesthetics of surprise and shock, and so on and so forth, and the history of masturbating in performance, starting with Vito Acconci. I mean, I had to do all of that, whereas everybody else just wanted to fail him, right? So, I mean, I am kind of support the youthful interest in shocking others and in testing the limits, because if you don't start to do that as an artist from the get-go, then you're just always going to be restricting yourself, and you'll never know how far you can go.
Do you think he could make that work now?
This was only a few years ago. I don't, somebody, the problem is every time you do something like that, then, people turn around and try to figure out 20 more rules they can impose so that you can never do it again, right? Sure. Like, I could never do the Cage Amerindian performance again, right? Because there are going to be a million ways to stop it from happening. So, but that's what a lot of the history performance is about kind of pushing things.
Yeah. My question would be if they got paid, and that would be my biggest concern. I would care if they got paid. That would be my question, is about the compensation for the performers.
Well,
I'm kind of joking here, but yeah.
I don't know whether the nudists get a chance to kind of expose themselves to others that often. So they might have thought that the payoff was more in the having the fun of doing their thing. Right.
Yeah. So there's a question about, is morality a metric by which to measure the veracity of a work? The question asker says, I assume not, though it's often used in art school.
Because you don't know how else to do it. Not because it's the right measurement.
Okay, how about sincerity? Does that matter?
Not always a good measure of the value of a work.
So could you talk more then?
Hallmark cards are sincere. Do you like them?
Yeah. So this is, So the question is, actually about what tools we can use to evaluate how a work actually works. And I want to add to that I'm curious how you work with your own students around doing the kind of critique that, that you're kind of suggesting is the right kind of most effective way to do critique.
Well, what am I doing right now these days? I'm teaching a studio performance class to advanced undergrads, and so we spend half the 6 hours of the week looking at work by established artists, and then the other half looking at their work, right? And talking about it. And so when they look at work by other people, we'll put on a video or look at photographs or read text or whatever, and then I say, okay, everybody write down a question that you have about this, right? And then we take turns kind of having a conversation about what each student's thought is about the work. But I'm like, we talk about the work, any question you want about the work, right? And then I think that's helps to then develop a kind of repertoire of questions when they begin to think about their own work and how they respond to their own, how the work that they make. And, I think students tend to either be really vituperative and attack, or be overly sensitive and not want to say anything bad. I mean, there's two extremes and not a lot in the middle. So I try to let people talk for a while, and then if I see that I don't see any criticality about something that I think could be criticized for a particular reason, then I'll wait and I'll be the last one. Say, well, I'm just going to observe this, and I think you could have done this, right? Or maybe you need to look at this.
Sometimes what I do too, and that sounds maybe like a very childish exercise, but I do it both with graduate and undergraduate students, is to ask the student or one of the students to just describe what they see. And I really, as if we all cannot see, but really describe what they are looking at. And this is often such a difficult exercise because immediately some kind of interpretation starts happening. And yeah, I like once in a while to throw that one in to kind of make students kind of aware again that you're always looking for filters. It's so hard to kind of really see a thing for what it is, and I think that that one exercise is sometimes a really good one to throw in the mix to really kind of bring it back to becoming aware of all the assumptions you are making looking at an artwork, about the artwork itself or the maker, but just really start with what is it that I'm actually looking at.
I'm trying to decide here how to go with this. So this is a really complex question. A lot of what is labeled outrage culture today stems from a small increase in the amount of exertable pressure the public has on previously closed, or institutions previously closed, has on previously closed institutions to reform themselves. For example, Me Too, about which innocent and proven guilty is also frequently said by nefarious actors. The removal...
It's still the law.
Still the law, okay. The removal of Southern statues, a public outcry about representation in private art museums. Are you concerned that this argument is merely taking the side of institutions of private power, like large museums, against this small uptick in public accountability?
There have been other moments of public outrage. I mean, I've been, you guys, like one now, it helps to be old, right? Like, this is not the first time. Right? I mean, there were a whole bunch of, during the culture wars, there was a lot of outrage. And you know what? It was all orchestrated by right-wing Christian evangelicals against gay artists and artists of color who got a little bit of money from the National Endowment for the Arts. And they mobilized themselves with their letter-writing campaigns out of their little storefront churches. And they got, the NEA basically defunded out of existence. So, it's just that, like, the outrage it's not a sign of empowerment, okay? It can also be the mobilization of mass hate. It can also be, like, people got, when there was a protest in front of the Brooklyn Museum because Lucifili, a black painter, okay, had his depiction of the Virgin Mary in the Sensation show, and there were a bunch of Catholics outside asking for his head on a platter. They hadn't even seen the painting, okay? They described the painting as being smeared with shit because Lucifili has, in the past, used elephant dung, which he shellacks, as a prop to hold up paintings, and also sometimes as one of the things that he applies to the surface of the painting. In the case of the painting of the Virgin Mary, it was the dung was shellacked on the bottom as a prop, okay? But this becomes, it's smeared with shit. He smeared the Virgin with shit, and now we're gonna kill him, and we're gonna destroy the Brooklyn Museum. That's also outrage, and it was based on a lie, that was inflamed by right-wingers, again, who, wanted to kind of go after public funding. I mean, you can't be so kind of innocent about the public, in quotation marks, is a commodity managed by marketing strategists and politicians and religious organizations in order to push policy. It's not authentic. I mean, for all the outrage about the Emmett Till painting, there were like less than 50 protesters there, representing all black people. They didn't represent me. They didn't represent any of the other black artists in the exhibition who were ignored because everybody was paying attention to the Dana Schutz painting, okay? So you gotta be careful when you say the public. The public exists as an abstraction. It's an idea, and it can be mobilized by a lot of people for all kinds of reasons, okay? I have dealt with, and there have been times when there have been more kind of specific subaltern community responses to public artworks. For example, I was called one time, I think it was by the Department of Cultural Affairs, this was like in the early 90s, because somebody had done a depiction of what the Lower East Side looked like in the 70s, and people who were living in the Lower East Side at the time were Puerto Rican and Dominican, and they didn't like the depiction, and so it became this kind of ethnic war of like, the Latinos don't like the white guy who made this painting. So, there are those kinds of things where you have to respond. Or there was another controversy in the same decade in New York because of some representation that was near a prison in downtown New York, and the prison guards union didn't like what was on the painting, and so they became the public. So, I think in each case you got to look at what public is this, and what are they saying? Okay, some museums that have the staff and the legal team to be able to manage crises, like for example the Whitney, they have their damage control for public outrage, right? They create a forum for people to come and talk about it and express their anger. Some museums even go so far as to create committees that are like community advisory committees. But, and whatever the institution thinks they should be doing, I'd say, okay, do it. But a lot of times what happens is that there is no further commitment to the institution other than the expression of outrage. All this stuff about art means a lot to us because we're in the business. It doesn't mean that much to other people, unless their preacher told them to write a letter, or they're pissed because whatever, the museum was built where their neighborhood was, and now they don't have a place to live anymore. I mean, usually it's just, I don't like that, and I'm going to scream about it, and then I'm going to leave, and I'm not going to work at the museum. I'm not going to come back and volunteer. I'm not going to go see another show. I'm not, there's no further engagement, right? So, if all you're going to do is come and complain as the public, I'm like, well, you didn't like it, okay. But that's not a commitment to the culture or the institution.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to interject a question that I really want to ask, which is kind of stemming from the controversy that you mentioned. There's a way of framing work as unjust or as damaging, and
Here we go again.
Yeah,
Guys,
no,
can we talk about art? I mean,
yeah, okay,
like,
that answers my question. Yeah. But I guess I'm curious what you say to people who say that the inclusion of certain work in an exhibition is unjust in some way.
That Whitney Biennial was the most ethnically diverse Whitney Biennial in the history of the Biennial. It was the first Biennial that was curated by non-white curators. Nobody who was so enraged by one painting paid any attention to all the other artists of color in that exhibition. They sucked all the press attention away from their fellow artists of color to make a stink about one minor work by Dana Schutz. If you ask me, that's misplaced effort, because I was really interested in Henry Taylor and Dina Lawson and William Popel and Post-Commodity and this, I don't even know the name of the artist, but it was a Southeast Asian who went to an island where Vietnamese refugees had been held at a particular time and went back there after the island was deserted and made the most amazing film. One of the most interesting things about what happened to Vietnam right after the war that I've ever seen. Who knows about that? Nobody, right? Because we didn't get a chance to have a conversation about all that other work. And that to me is very unfortunate.
All right, well, I'm aware of the time. I'd like if we could thank Kirsten and Coco for joining us tonight for this panel. And before we leave the stage, I'll just make a plug for there's additional mixed media programming this semester. I do not immediately remember what the next thing is, but I'd encourage you to check that out. Thanks for coming.